Columbia Pictures presents Heavy Metal. A trip beyond the future to a universe you've never seen before. A universe of mystery. A universe of passionate fantasies. A universe of terrifying evil. A universe of magic. Heavy Metal.
Hello and welcome to the Damian and Devlin show, and this is our review of Heavy Metal, the 1981 animated classic directed by Gerald Potterton. It was a Canadian and American film that became a huge cult classic. It actually did make some money at the box office, not a lot. It actually costed about $9 million to make, and it made about $20 million, but in video rentals, Blu-ray rentals, when they finally came out, it always seemed forever for them to come out, but when they did, they sold big. This movie is a classic for a certain generation, and it's an animated film that features a lot of Canadian voice work, including a lot of SCTV alumni, John Candy, Joe Flaherty, just to name a few. Now, I picked this film. This is a movie from my youth that I absolutely adored. I saw this the first time when I was just a little kid. My brother used to take me to the drive-in, and he and some friends took me to this. Now, I wanted to see the first feature. I had no clue what heavy metal was, and basically, I saw the second film, and I was probably watched the whole film with my mouth wide open. I had never seen an animated movie that had violence, sexual connotations, and boobs. I think we're okay to say boobs. I'm saying boobs.
Big giant badonkadonks.
Yeah. Now, this was based on a very popular magazine, I think it's still running, called Heavy Metal. And this story is basically an anthology of stories that are locked together by one story. A green orb called the Lochner, which is supposed to be everything pure evil. And the stories, that's the only link in all these stories. And the stories range from crazy, weird, to downright scary in certain cases. And if you know the magazine, if you've seen any of it, it was a big magazine. It was science fiction, animated. It had very famous science fiction writers who wrote the stories. All the stories in this particular movie were ones that came from the pages of the magazine. Now, Damian had heard of this movie and saw little clips and stuff, but this was his first viewing. I was kind of intrigued how this movie would translate to his generation because, as I said, it's very notorious. You can say heavy metal and you can tell they were brought up in the 70s, 80s because they're like, oh yeah, heavy metal. And let's see what Damian's first initial thoughts.
Well, I mean, let's see what I think about it. So, I can definitely tell it's a product of the early 80s because, well, the soundtrack is just nothing but, like, at the time, 80s heavy metal bands. I mean, it fit in well with the title of the actual movie. I'd never heard of the magazine, but I had heard of the movie before. I'd seen little snippets here and there. Of course, the iconic image, if you've never seen it before, of this lovely lady right here riding what I assumed to be some kind of velociraptor sort of deal, or sorry, not velociraptor, pterodactyl sort of deal.
Yeah. I thought it was a pigeon, but yeah, you're right. We'll go with pterodactyl. That's much cooler than a pigeon.
Riding a pigeon into battle. But I'd seen that image many times, and yeah, you're right. Like, your generation notoriously knows about this movie. Like, you mentioned heavy metal. Even though you might not be talking about this, you might be talking about the music genre, and they're like, oh yeah, heavy metal, exactly like you said. So, my father actually watched this movie back in the times when I knew him, and he was obsessed with it for a little bit of time from what I remember. And that's basically all of my knowledge of this movie. And seeing it for the first time is interesting. With your question, does it translate well to my generation? I'm going to say if you're of the hipster orientation, probably yes. If you're not of the hipster orientation, probably going to fall a little bit flat, but I'll talk about how I truly feel with my positive and negatives after.
As I said, this was a movie of its time, its generation. The animation is very crude, but a lot of the indie stuff that like Don Bluth was doing at the time, this kind of stuff, classic R-rated movies like Fritz the Cat. I don't know if I'll ever show him that, but boy, his eyes would be like, what? If he thinks he saw that in Heavy Metal. Fritz the Cat. And I like this style of animation, but I'll wait to get into my positives. So why don't we get right into it? Your positives for Heavy Metal.
So I do have to go off the top with the soundtrack. The soundtrack's pretty fantastic. When it was the opening crawl, like the credits, it was featuring music from these bands, and it had like a who's who of heavy metal 80s bands. Well, I mean, like back in the day, they'd be considered heavy metal. These days, it's just like hard rock, classic rock. But it was pretty heavy for the time, and I was quite impressed with what I saw. I was like, there's Black Sabbath in there, Sammy Hagar, so on and so forth.
Cheap Trick.
Yeah, like Journey's in there, so like so many good bands are in there, and the soundtrack's pretty good. I did like some of the stories, not all of them. I'll touch more on that in my negatives, but there are two story arcs in particular that stood out to me. One is the very first one, and it's kind of like in a 2031 New York City following a cab driver called Harry Canyon.
Yeah.
Was that his name? Yeah, I like that one. And it's set in 2030, which by this it's a little bit like over 10 years away,
yeah.
And if that's the way that New York City's going to look.
It's weird watching old science fiction when you realize, I used to be an old fan of the old Buck Rogers show, but when you find out that Buck did all this in 1999, it kind of kills it now because it's not really futuristic. Anyhow, but yeah, we're getting closer to it.
So I liked that story arc. The other story arc that I liked is the one that scared the crap out of you as a kid. Is it follows like these World War II B-52 bomber pilots. I guess they're flying to a mission, and then it talks about or deals with them coming back from their mission, but something goes wrong on the plane. And I really found myself interested in that story. I wanted to know more about it. Unfortunately, it was one of the shorter story arcs, the B-52 bomber one, but it was good nonetheless.
A lot of people remember that one. First, when you mention Heavy Metal to people who have seen this when they were younger, you'll see, first they'll talk about like the nudity, the bodacious ladies in this, but then they say, but remember that weird one with the World War II jets that was just creepy and freaked you out? But I admit, watching it now, I think it's actually one of the most artistic ones.
Yeah, so I'll give you one of my negatives. Most of the art style in this is not good in my standards, but the art style that does stand out is the one with the World War II bombers. And I just felt it was the most smooth and fluid and actual nice looking. And like you said, it's very crude. And even though one of the story arcs, the one I'm talking about with like Harry Canyon and all that, that's an art style that I did not enjoy, but I enjoyed the story behind the art style. So it kind of hand in hand there, but it's very crude drawings, very stiff and like still. I could tell like it was early animation. Like when you're watching old animation, it's not as smooth and pristine as it is these days. I mean, we don't do paper and pencil or pen anymore anyways. It's all flash animation or done on a tablet somewhere. But it was okay in some aspects, but for the most part, not really. Like I know that's already one of my negatives, but that's pretty much all that I have positive to say about it. I'll leave the rest of the positives to you, but soundtrack and two of the story arcs, very, very good.
My positives, I will go the opposite way. I understand. I see the scenes that you're talking about. They are very crude in drawing. But what I like about it is it's because everything in this movie is edgy. The storytelling, the fact that you probably couldn't get away with a lot of the stuff that you did. I like that the edgy animation kind of fits with all that. And that's why I like it, because it was almost like, because like, as I said, I love watching like Pixar and Disney and seeing the advances they make. Even Disney movies were still amazing to see at this time in 81, even though they were hitting their period that some people consider their lowest form. Some of my favorite Disney films, like The Rescuers, came around that time. Anyhow, what I liked about it was that it was almost, they did it in that way in order to be against, like, the perfection that Disney was trying to find. It was almost like in your face, and I think it works in so many ways. It's one of my favorite things about this. I also get a little sentimental because this isn't a Canadian-American thing, and I always found that I always was impressed by that. I was happy that this was kind of got some Canadian in it. I think a lot of the Canadian was done with some of the animation because from what I heard, all the segments were done in different animation houses, but they had a certain style. But even when you watch them, you can tell that even though the styles look similar, they filmed them in their own kind of way, as in like some, like you mentioned, the skin colors would change on some of them. Like backgrounds were like psychedelic where others were more detailed. So I think they had like this is a template to follow, but you don't have to follow it exactly. Make it your own. And it kind of gives it a psychedelic thing. But I always liked that because a lot of animation was done in Canada through many things. A lot of Canadians worked on Disney films and stuff. So I love stuff like Ralph Bakshi. I can never pronounce his name. He did stuff like the Fritz the Cat. He did the Lord of the Rings, which is loved and hated. But I like that edgy kind of animated. You're familiar with that one?
Yeah.
And, you know, even like the Don Bluth stuff that took the Disney style, because he used to work at Disney and he took it and made it his own and made like darker movies. I love that kind of stuff. But I love that Canada gets a shout out, and a lot of the voice, like John Candy, Joe Flaherty went on to do like SCTV, or were doing SCTV at the time. So there is a feel of a Canadiana of this movie. And this movie, like as I said, it had a lot of problems getting to video a lot of times because there'd be lawsuits. Like we couldn't get the rights to the songs because there was a time that movies were made before video. So there was nothing in the contract to say, you know, Cheap Trick will lend you this song. And I'm using this for an example. I'm not saying Cheap Trick sued them. But when the VHS came out, there was nothing in the contract that said, no, we never said you could use that on VHS. You're going to make more money. So a lot of times it took forever. It took forever to come out on VHS. I remember when I got the VHS, I was so excited. And then Blu-ray, that took forever too, because again, but I love this movie because of the fact that we used to, you know, watch old pay-per-view channels, and, you know, sometimes they'd have free previews and it's like, oh, 2 o'clock heavy metal, and we'd stay up because, you know, it doesn't matter that I'm a young gay guy, I still seeing the, you know, the stories of the darkness and the bodacious babes, it's just, that was a thing. That's, you know, I
don't want to be superficial, but I'll throw the bodacious babes in there too. Yeah. Like, that was hot.
So yeah, and I know some people will think, oh come on, there was not like a flat-chested woman in this movie, but you know what? That was of its time, and I think it's, you know, I think they handle most of it well. We'll see if he brings that up as a negative. So that's really my positives. A lot of nostalgia. I do like the crude animation for me personally, and I do have some negatives on this film that we'll let you get to.
I'm curious to know what your negatives are. Without trashing the movie completely, the biggest thing for me to get over was, first of all, the lack of cohesion. And the reason I say that is because, like Devlin mentioned, there are different story arcs all kind of tying together into one overarching arc. And because of that, I didn't really find myself attached to any of the characters. Like, it was just like, here's that, that's that. Okay, that one's kind of neat. But I didn't really care about anybody. Like, yeah, sure, some of the characters were neat and interesting, and I wanted to know more about them. But when the story ended, I was kind of disappointed. I wanted to know more about it. So, like, for example, when we first went to Henry Canyon. Henry Canyon. Just imagining a canyon full of hair. But when we first went to him, I mean, not too wrong for the kind of plot that it followed, if you get what I'm throwing. But when it ended, I was kind of disappointed because I thought that was what the whole movie was going to be. It was just following him and this woman then on their journey with the Lochnar. And that's not how it turned out. So I got kind of disappointed when I realized I caught on, okay, it's going to be different stories going through. And that kind of disappointed me, not gonna lie. I wish it was a whole consistent, because you actually made a comment right when we went to Harry Canyon. You were like, oh, if this was a live action, this would have been perfect for Bruce Willis in his prime. Yeah. So you actually kind of planted the seeds in my mind that this was gonna be the whole movie.
Sorry.
And when it turned out not to be, I got so upset. And again, I'll touch on it again. I'm not gonna beat it to death, but the drawings, the art style is just so crude in some parts. Like, I could tell that it was amateurish. Maybe it wasn't amateurish, but it just seemed amateurish to me, and I didn't really enjoy it. Then again, not to be unfair, like I said, there's some good animation in it, like the World War II kind of mini plot there. That was good. And also with her name, what is she called again?
She's a Tarakian, but it's like Tarna. I can never remember her name.
Yeah, so with her story arc right at the end there, the animation was okay. It really reminded me of, and we actually made a joke about it, of He-Man and the Masters of the Universe. That's what the art style reminded me of in that story arc for a while. So that was okay. It was alright. It wasn't the best, but it was okay. It's just those things bottled together kind of brought me out of it, as well as I really didn't care about some of the story arcs as well. I found them kind of boring. Like there's one, you kept quoting it, but it was about the guy with the huge chin. What was his name? Stern! Yeah, that one. I could care less about what that one was. As well as there was like a random one thrown in there as well where it's at the Pentagon, and like some scientist and a woman get abducted by aliens, and then just, they do cocaine and that's it. Like, what is going on here? Like, it didn't make sense to me, so I didn't appreciate that. And yeah,
it was a late night party movie too. Like, people didn't want anything.
Like, don't get me wrong. If I were on acid or mushrooms, like, this would have been a fantastic.
I never did drugs. I just want to say ever. I don't do drugs. I've never done it through this movie. But I admitted, I'm sure a lot of people do.
Oh yeah, like there's a one shot of like them walking, and you even said, "Oh, I love that imagery." And they're like walking across a horizon. In the background is like this red velvety kind of neat thing going on, and then there's like a scene of her riding her pterodactyl pigeon, and it's like kind of neat with the psychedelic imagery, but I could tell, like, if you're popping shrooms or something, you're having a good time, but if you're not, it's kind of boring.
All right, that's fair. I think anthology TV shows like Twilight Zone, Alfred Hitchcock, I think they do better because you have a half hour to develop each story. And I think when they do anthology movies like a Heavy Metal or a Creep Show or something, I think they do have some issues. And that is my big problem. I do agree with you. I like that all the stories are tied together by the Lochner, but I almost wish the stories... I had no problem not really bonding with the characters because I just was like intrigued by what we're going to see next. But I thought some of the stories don't really work with the whole this is pure evil. Like, I know they show essence, like this guy's going to turn into like a raging Hulk, but it's such a minute part in the story. I would have liked to actually see them go with stories that were more cohesive, because some of the stories you're like, I don't call them boring, but I don't feel that they're important to what this ultimate evil is. You know, I find, okay, it's an intriguing little piece, but it's not like other stories show the Lochnar, like everybody wants it. Like in the Harry Canyon, everybody wants it. They'll die for it. In the finale one with the girl, it's like it's taken over like the whole universe. Even the one with Den, which is a very funny one with John Candy as a young boy who suddenly looks like Dwayne Johnson running around like having every woman wanting to have sex with him. It's a cute story, but even there, the Lochnar is important because it's like summoning some kind of demons that, you know. But there's other stories that just, well, they're kind of angry. And it's like, yeah, I think more could have been done. And I think I do like the World War II one because it does sit out on its own, because all the stories except only two really don't have humor in them. And it's jarring after you see like three stories that throw in little bits of humor and then suddenly you're like serious. But so I wish the stories were worked a little bit better in it. Number two, I like the soundtrack a lot, but even as a kid, I knew that Black Sabbath was the only name that was actually a heavy metal band. Yeah. I knew, because I was a music lover, I loved Cheap Trick and Devo and Sammy Hagar, but I knew that Devo was new wave, and I knew Cheap Trick and Sammy Hagar were rock. And so I a lot of people might shock me, I actually like listening too heavy metal sometimes. And I actually think there should have been actually more heavy metal music in this.
I would agree.
It's a great soundtrack, but Journey doesn't stir up heavy metal images when I'm like, maybe I should have gotten some Iron Maiden or Judas Priest or something a little.
Absolutely.
But I love the soundtrack, but I don't think it's the soundtrack for this. When the song that I'm humming after I see this is Journey's Open Arms, which is one of the most beautiful ballads of the time, it doesn't scream heavy metal.
No,
so they could have come up with something more. So the soundtrack is not disappointing, but for this movie is disappointing.
Okay. Yeah, no,
So that's my two big negatives, and so we sort of agree on the story.
Sort of. So while you're talking, actually, another thing that really confused me about the plot is that certain people die when coming in contact with the Lochnar, and the Lochnar is supposed to be the embodiment of pure evil, like he said. But all I ever really saw was the Lochnar killing the bad people. I never actually really saw the Lochnar kill good people. So that confused me. As well, at the end, I got really confused. And I'm not going to say what happens, just in case you want to check this out and you've never seen it before, but I got really confused because the Lochnar ties it all together. He's like, look into me and see the stories that I have lived through and whatnot. Know what it is to be the Lochnar, so on and so forth. And then he kind of just, I'll leave it like that. Like, I can't say anything because I'll spoil it, but it's just confusing at the end. So that's another negative to me is the fact that, A, the Lochnar only seems to be killing bad people but keeping the good people alive. And then the plot there at the very end confused me quite significantly. Also, I wanted to ask you guys, because I threw the question out to him, but he wasn't sure. Is Elon Musk a fan of heavy metal? Because the opening scene is this spaceman in a car, and it looks so identical to recently Elon Musk sent his Tesla Roadster up into space to orbit the Earth with the camera on it, and it looks exactly like the spaceman in the car from heavy metal.
I wouldn't be surprised.
So I gotta ask,
I don't know. I can't verify it, but we should look into it.
Do you guys know if he's a fan of heavy metal? Because to me, it seems like he was, and that's kind of why he did the whole, let's launch this spaceman into space with this car. But yeah, what are you going to give this movie?
Okay, this movie isn't for everyone, and I'll be the first to acknowledge that. Like, I wasn't sure what Damian's reaction was, but every once in a while I like to throw him a curveball and just see what he wants. But if you're like an artist, or if you're into like more avant-garde cinema, I strongly recommend heavy metal, because I think you will find some stuff in it that you will really like. And as you said, I don't like to use the word hipster, but if you like that kind of old retro stuff, then definitely give it a shot, because it's good. Yeah. But if you like, I like a good Disney film or Pixar, or I prefer anime, you might want to stick to those, things, because this is not any of that. But I like it enough, and I'm going to actually give it a 4 out of 5.
Really?
I like this movie. It's iconic to me. And I vote sometimes nostalgically, but I think it holds up for what it is.
All right, fair enough. For me, it was a lot to take in, and like I said, at times I really did find it boring. So with all that in mind, as well as what I've already said, I have to give it 1.5. 1.5 out of 5 for me.
All right. So that was our review of heavy metal.
Yeah.
Hopefully you check it out. Like, as always we said, we have 2 alternative things here, but the most important reaction is what you think. If you think this interests you, give it a shot. If not, see what we review next week. It might be something more that you'd be interested in.
Hey, you never know. That's what the great thing about subscribing to us is. You never know what's going to come up next. Also, I just want to let you guys know we are getting very, very close to July, and as you may have known in our previous reviews, I've kind of left little hints and dabbles here that we're going to be planning something special in July. More information to come around June, so stay tuned for that. Let us know, what did you think about heavy metal? Did you like the movie? I almost said music, because heavy metal makes me think of music. Did you like the movie, or did you not like the movie? Have you even seen it? Let us know. We always want to know. Thanks so much for joining us. We hope to see you next time, and as always, stick around.
science fiction.